Welcome back, Rabbi Dr. Eliezerbrodt. It's a pleasure to be back with you. And we are back to our series on Moron Rav Chaim Kanievsky Zatzal. We already did this season 6 episodes discussing manuscripts, and the connection to Rav Chaim was different manuscripts that Rav Chaim used to use and how these manuscripts evolved throughout the generation. We've come to a point now, which is there's a big discussion in the current or modern day world, Chazon Ish Shitah, on using manuscripts. So that is going to be today's topic. I think Rabbi Brot plans on doing 2 episodes on this. And once again, we would like to thank our sponsor for the Reb Chaim Kanievsky episodes. This whole season 2 has been dedicated anonymously by a close friend of Rabbi Dr. Brot, Le'ila Nishmas Moshe Chaim Ben Yitzchak David, all the Torah and all the new knowledge that people get from these episodes should be a Eloi for his neshama. Something interesting, people constantly ask you, what do you have going on behind you? What are those piles of books and more books? And they get a tiny, tiny glimpse, tiny window into the collection that you have. And you could talk about another time the addiction that you have to collecting Sfarim, and that's for another session. But perhaps today, maybe at the end of the episode, you could turn around, pull one book out, and just go through one book. We got to start somewhere. Pull out a book and tell the audience, open a book and tell them what this book is, what it's about, why you have it. You think that's something that perhaps is an idea?
We'll try. Maybe we'll randomly pull out Gairul Hagra. We'll do a Gairul Hagra.
Rabbi Brot is in for some fun today. Okay, so everyone stay tuned till the end. The end of the episode, Rabbi Brot promises, bli neder, to pull out a book and talk about it. Let's not forget. So what are we talking about today?
So we're going to talk about up till now we discussed the Shitah of, to sum up what we did and what we will now do is as follows. Until now, I claimed there's 2 approaches. Approach number 1, we're going to call it, to make it life simple, the Mishnah Brurer's Shitah, which is to use new discoveries of Reshonim ad halacha l'maisa. And there was another Shitah, which we're going to call it the Chazon Ish Shitah, not to use the new discoveries of the new Reshonim. That's to make life simple in a sentence. So the next few episodes, up till now, we in the first 6 episodes of this season, I outlined in broad strokes some of the history of the publishing and usage of new manuscripts. I was able to show pretty much that everyone used them with no issues, not just the Mishnah Brura. And especially what's important for us is Reb Chaim Kanievsky. He appears from all his writings to collect the Mishnah Brura. He embraces everything, new midrashim, ga'inik discoveries, rishonim discoveries, and to the extent that he even worked on editing some of these manuscripts for print, which we spoke about. Now, before we begin talking about the Chazon Ish Shitah, I just found, mamish in the past few days, a piece of information relating to this from Chaim Zimmerman, who also talks about the usage of manuscripts. And he says, I found it very interesting. I'm not going to read the whole passage. It's over 2 pages, but he says like this. When a new manuscript of a sefer of a Rishon is discovered, a new universe of Torah comes into being. Then he refers to another book of his, and he says, basically, as much Chachma is revealed to a generation, so that much Chachma of the Torah has to be revealed. Today, he says we're in the Zman of a Chalta de Gula, so although no theoretical concepts of the science are developed, many technological discoveries are developed every day. So in Torah, for the last 50 years, there were discovered many manuscripts of the Rishonim and the Halacha and Agada. Their discovery is parallel and proportional to modern technological discoveries in the physical world. This is the real reason why so many manuscripts were discovered and restored in this generation. Never was there a period in history where so many manuscripts were found and published in the Torah world as in our time. He says there's no Ga'inim like Reb Chaim Brisker or others that the sum total Torah amount had to flow in this generation proportionally to the meager amount of Chachma. So what do we do? Hashem Yisbarach made it, and he elaborates on this, the new discoveries of manuscripts. So this is, I found, to be a very interesting take, and he is saying this to understand is he dies in the 90s. I think it was in the 1990s. So if you're taking that into account, in recent years, it's been a bigger explosion than when he went from his time of new manuscripts. Okay.
So you mentioned Chaim Zimmerman. maybe tell the audience who he is. You can't just leave us hanging that way.
Okay, so I'm definitely Chaim Zimmerman is a person that's worthy, very worthy of having a few episodes to discuss him. But he was famous for being Rosh Hashiva in Skokie for a while. Eventually, in the 1970s, he made Aliyah. He was considered Ilui in all standards. He was a nephew and a Talmud of Reb Baruch Ber, very, very into the Torah of his Rebbe Reb Baruch Ber. But he also was very into the Chazon Ish. He was very mathematically gifted, and for example, in the famous Dateline Shaila, he wrote a massive 500-page work, all aspects of it, demonstrating his yada not only in lumdus and in learning, but in understanding of the sciences. And he was a very unique, out-of-the-box gadol, a very big, deep thinker. He wrote a lot in Hebrew and in English. I think a lot of his articles actually appeared in the Jewish press at some for a while, but I that was before my time. And some of them were collected in various books. One of the books I just read from is called Torah and Existence, and he has another book called Torah and Reason, and there's other books in English and other lumdish svarim of his of all types. They're all pretty hard to find these days, but anyway, he was a unique, tremendous Talmud Chacham that died in, I believe it was 1995.
Okay, fine. So now you've given us the information about what you've done. We're ready to get the Chazon Ish's Shitah, but everyone talks about it, the Chazon Ish's Shitah, manuscripts, what he holds. Perhaps you could show us some sourced information, whether it's books and svarim that everyone knows about, some articles. I think that's what we are all waiting to hear.
Okay, so first, like this. The first question is really to step back a drop, and is to ask: is Chaim Kanievsky, which I'm claiming, which is pretty obvious, Chaim Kanievsky is using these new manuscripts and everything. So is this unique in the Beis Medrash of the Chazon Ish to embrace it, or there are other people in the Beis Medrash of the Chazon Ish besides Chaim Kanievsky that embrace the new discoveries? The answer is, in the first season, I spoke a few times. I mentioned that the Chaim Kanievsky was influenced by 4 different great people. One of them was his father, who not only did he have a tremendous impact on him, they learned Kol Torah Kula literally together. So when you look about the Steipler, you find that, number one, we spoke about already, that the Reb Chaim Kanievsky worked on the Rekeach, publishing it from manuscript. Who got him the job was the Steipler. Very unlikely to say that the Steipler would be against publishing new manuscripts and get him the job if he was against it. Now, the Steipler, like many other Gedolim, gave haskamas. A lot of these haskamas are collected in the volume of his letter, the 3 volumes of his letters called Kraina de Igrasa, and in there we find Lamashal, a beautiful haskama on the discovery of Rabbeinu Hillel's Pirish on the Sifri. That's one discovery, and now it's very unlikely that he would give a beautiful haskama if he didn't believe in these new discoveries, that there's some benefit of having these manuscripts. In the same volume, that we find another. There was someone in England, Rav Halperin, published some new material of Taisvis on Masechtas Nedarim. The Steipler gives a beautiful haskama, worthy of reading all his Lashonis, but explaining how that Hashem Yisbarach makes it that that certain materials come to light at certain periods of time, and our generation was to be goyal these different Rishonim, and we miskablim b'ahava b'simcha rabba ba'ali Torah v'loim dea. He mentions even that there are plenty still in manuscript. But anyway, he writes very, very enthusiastic about these materials from these new manuscripts relating to Taisis Masechtas Nedarim. And another haskama, one other one is to mention is the Taisis Rush. Someone brought him a Taisis Rush on a different Masechta. And the Steipler also gave a very nice haskama, but here, just a cute thing, was he said a lot of times, how do we know that it's a Taisis Rush? So he says, my son Reb Chaim Kanievsky told me that the Shaar Melech in Hilchos Yisodei Torah brings down a piece from this Taisis Rush, from this manuscript. This was on, so here we have a way how it's authenticated, and was authenticated by his great son, Reb Chaim Kanievsky, is Bekias not only in Rishonim, and in Geonim, and in Chazals. Here we see him being Baki in Achronim, the Shaar Melech. Okay. Anyway, the point, what's interesting is that the Kraina de Igrasa, for some reason, they censor out the names and the names of the Svarim in a lot of these letters. I don't know why, but that's the, we see, but bottom line, we see the Steipler seems to be somewhat pro using new manuscripts. Maybe not Lalacha Lamaisa, but using them. Next, another person, which we also spoke a little bit about in season 1, was Kalman Kahana, someone who was very close with the Chazon Ish. And Kalman Kahana was Isaac very much in Zran, not only in Halacha L'Maisa of Zram, but publishing new works, a manuscript Sayev Rishonim, and different materials relating to helping Masech Limud of Masech Zram, new discoveries, and a large part of he ended up establishing a mechon. And what's significant is this mechon was taken over eventually by Rebbe Frati, Talmud Muvik by Rebbe Yashiv. Everything was done under the hashgacha, so to speak, of Rebbe Yashiv. They learn ad hayoim intense Zram, Be'iyun, Halacha L'Maisa, but also focus on publishing materials from manuscripts. So much, many works of Rishonim on Zram that have come out through them. And just to mention, L'mashal, the Kafta Referach, they did a beautiful job based on manuscripts. So here we see, again, people that are affiliated, I would say, or extending from the Beis Medrash of the Chazon Ish. So it's funny, the Steipler, Kalman Kahana, Chaim Zimmerman, these are people that the Chazon Ish meant a lot, even though the Chazon Ish meant a lot to most people, but these are Mamish Talmidim, swore everything by him. It's strange that they would go against him so blatantly. Okay. That's the background of I'm just trying to make it dramatic. Okay. Now, but the question is really, what does the Chazon Ish hold? So the Chazon Ish in general was beyond prolific, and he was prolific, which is not the case of many Gedolim, even in his lifetime. He's born in the 1878, and he dies in 1953. He first publishes his first work, Chazon Ish, in 1911. It's well known, he doesn't write his name on it, but he already published materials in some newspapers beforehand, as early as, I think, 1901. So he wrote a lot. We know he wrote literally on Kol Torah Kula. You go into a shul library, or many people have in their houses, Chazon Ish, it's mind-boggling how much he wrote. To make a reshima, a proper listing, a bibliographical of all his materials that he wrote, is very hard. Already 10 years after he was nifter, or Kalman Kahana, we just mentioned, has a beautiful listing, and we read it, it's mind-boggling how much he published at that period, by that period of time already. So now, we have to keep that in mind. He wrote a lot. So to find his Shitah in something that could be spread out in a lot of different places is a hard job. Number two is, they're constantly finding new material. Just as an example, in the past few years, 5 massive volumes on the Chazon Ish of materials of his has come out from manuscripts called Gnozim V'Tshuvas Chazon Ish. And more keeps on coming out. I always joke that one of the Gedolim that's writing from the grave besides Rabbi Kiva and the Chassam Sofer is the Chazon Ish. Just yesterday I saw going up on auction a huge selection of 50 materials of the Chazon Ish. Yes, if someone wants to buy it for me, I will accept it. Of different pratim relating to the Chazon Ish that seems to have been on his table on the days that right before he died. I have no idea where they had it, where they got it from. It sounds very interesting. I did not have a chance to look at the full description of it, but it sounds crazy.
Was the Chazon Ish's table as big as Reb Chaim Brisker's table?
Good. That's a good question. I don't know. After I read carefully these items, maybe we'll be able to have a question what's what. Anyway, the point is the Chazon Ish wrote a lot. Now, besides writing a lot and publishing it, he also wrote letters that were given to regular people. He also spoke to many people. He had Talmidim, and he had people that came into him, Keseder. So, in order to get such a person's Shitah clear in a matter that could come up many times, it's not easy. Okay, now, in general, in order to understand the Shitah of the Chazon Ish, so to speak, for this, you have to check up all the quotes. You have to see firsthand, if you could, the different quotes that he says. Now, the problem is that some of them were censored, and you don't know the context of the letters, who he's writing it, and what's he writing it about. Why is he saying what he's saying? Which makes it harder. But it makes it even harder is that sometimes new materials come to light about a particular piece of information and then sheds light on, up till now you thought a certain way, and then a new sentence comes to light. They reprint the letter and they add, we have the manuscript, we're adding one more line. That line could be a key to understanding much more. And this happens a lot with the Chazon Ish, and even in this topic. One of the letters that's not as well known is a discussion with is a letter that Dateline writes about talking to the Chazon Ish about it. And then just recently, a few months ago, the letter came out again, but this time they added a few more lines. And those few lines, as I'm going to show in the next episode, helps us understand much more with what the Chazon Ish meant. Anyway, these are just some of the points now. So when a lot of the quotes of the Chazon Ish relating to this topic and others is found in the Chibur, Kovetz Igros Chazon Ish, well-known Chibur, very famous, 3 volumes. Now, the problem is when they quote a lot of these letters, and they have different pieces, they don't tell you who it's going on, who it was written to, when it was written, and sometimes they take out sentences. All of a sudden there'll be a dot, 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 and you don't know what's going on. Rabbi Tiger, who we've quoted a few times, mentions in his work called Kuntres Derech Ish, incredible small work on the Chazon Ish. He shows how a certain tshuva of the Chazon Ish was cut up over 6 times, put into 6 different places, but you don't know that when you're reading each one of the letters until you actually see the whole letter published. And there's a bunch of examples. We're not going to go into that now. Now, if you open up the Kovetz Igros Chazon Ish, so the first volume, which literally came out within a year or two after he's nifter, it stresses that it's murdic significant, the Chazon Ish's letters. He was it helped. He did so much. It will help people to Amalei Torah, Diktik Halacha, all different types of things. People used to ask him all different pieces of information, all different questions, and so we have these letters. Now, the letters, they not necessarily saw all the manuscripts of the letters, but they published it. Now, in the volume 3, which comes out also in the 50s, pretty much right within a few years, less than 5 years after the Chazon Ish is being nifter, it says, Harba igros yicholis l'shamish k'maiser rav upiske halachos binyani limra Torah chinuch v'yeshivas van hagas binyani tzibur. So it's sort of a halacha l'maiser dika work. Okay? Now, Rabbi Yamin Zilber, one of the Dateline B'nai Brak, a famous author of Tshuvas Aznit Brew, who had a schus to have a connection with the Chazon Ish, he writes in a few different letters. He says, when he's talking about this volume specifically, the Kovetz Igros of the Chazon Ish, he says, it's not a sefer, it's not klal halacha. And he says, the Chazon Ish used to say, don't rely on things that I said, that people that say from my name, Baal Peh. Even letters, it's considered Baal Peh. So he's saying that pretty much we don't know the background of the particular letter, so beware. And as I said, not all letters are taken from manuscripts. Some of these letters are from conversations, and they don't even tell you where those conversations are from. Okay. My grandfather, Rabbi Leib Spitz, had in a piece that he wrote in the journal called Hamayim in the 80s. So the question that he was dealing with related to a specific letter of the Chazon Ish. He goes so far as to say that if you look carefully, he couldn't believe that the Chazon Ish said what he said in that letter. So he said that the letter is not a bar samcha. It does not sound like the Chazon Ish said it. He said, because it came out after he dies, they got tons of materials from all over the world. Some of the stuff, there wasn't labels, but they published it, and it could be they didn't go through everything carefully enough to verify every single thing that it came from the Chazon Ish. And he brings even from a Radvaz such an issue that you can't rely on tshuvas that came out afterwards. Okay, whatever. My point is that if you look very carefully, this is a general issue with the Chazon Ish and other Gedolim, plenty of other Gedolim, that when you find their works, you have to be very careful to see the sources and to know what the Makar is, who's saying it, etc. Now, just to talk about this a little, just a drop longer, and then we're going to get to the meat and potatoes, as they say. Professor Yaakov Spiegel, who I've quoted numerous times in the past, he has a book called Amudim B'Tol Sefer Ivri. It's 5 volumes. In one of the volumes, he deals with this concept in general terms, not specifically about the Chazon Ish. But many times we find Reshonim could write 2 different svarim, and there could be steers between the 2 svarim. Reshonim and Achrayim. I mean, everyone knows Rambam. Let's say the steers and Rambam, and then we're busy answering it. But it's common. Let's say the Rush. If you have a steer between the Rush and his Psakim to Rush and Chuvas, what do you do? So let's say you have a Chazon Ish says one thing, and then you have in the Igros that's a written Igros, and we know it's from him. It's a stira possibly. So what do? And there's all types of klolim. The Gedolim, Meshech, the generations gave all different types of klolim, which this Professor Spiegel outlines all this. There's another issue. Not necessarily everything that is said Gadol want printed. Especially, there's a question. Letters. A lot of times Gedolim did not want printed. They were meant mamish for one-on-one private conversation. There was a controversy a few years back. Professor Mark Shapiro published many interesting letters that the Sri Deish had with Professor Atlas. Very, very interesting things. And then people were very upset. These were private letters. They were not necessarily supposed to be published. So Spiegel brings this down also, and this caused the whole discussion in the Torah Mada journal back and forth about it. Okay.
So you can't just mention Professor Atlas like run by without mentioning who he is?
Okay, so the answer is that he was a person that learned in Slobodka Yeshiva, eventually becomes a professor. It seems he becomes affiliated with Reform, but he still loved learning, and he had a close relationship with the Sri H. They have many different letters back and forth, but he also put out, interestingly enough, the Ravid on Baba Kama with Be'indik Ha'aris. The Mashal in Lakewood, there was at least one edition of a Ravid, the Ha'aris were all crossed out, Apikairis or Kfira or whatever, something like that. Anyway, so they had very interesting letters back and forth, which were published in the Torah Mother Journal, and it caused some type of scandal. If it would have been the times of the internet, I'm sure it would have been much more. And the editor at the time, Rabbi Schechter, had to defend why he did it, whatever. Okay, so anyway, the point is, for Negea to us, is a lot of times letters are really meant for privacy. So Kovetz Igros, even though there is a lot of Yesaitis, what he's saying, but maybe he didn't want it to get out. Okay. Anyway, there's all types of these type of conversations. Spiegel deals with it in his work, and this plays out even more, and we will get to some aspects of it in a later episode with Chaim Kanievsky. Because what's happened is that there's a whole genre of new Sfarim, which they map out all the Anhagas that people see, that they watch Gadol A doing, and Gadol B and Chaim Kanievsky. There's a crazy amount of these types of Sfarim coming out, and there's of plenty of more recent years of Gedolim like this. But it's already found, let's say the Maril was a Talmud of the Maril, watched the Maril carefully, and he would record what he saw, and it became one of the main sources for the Ramah. So obviously, certain times these works have very important impact on Allah. Anyway, with the Chazon Ish, a lot of times there could be a psak, and you'll check into it, and then you'll see what the next person will say. It's not true. He didn't mean it. I just want to give. You could give many different examples for this. I'm not going to. Spiegel, in his latest book called Amudim Metola Sefer Ivri, has 3 different places where he talks all about the Chazon Ish with these aspects, quoting different steers in the stories and in the different things. I'm just going to mention 2 very, very brief ones, and that gives you the idea. One was that someone said something about a certain piece of the Bir Hagra, a famous piece of the Bir Hagra, and hold on, just give me a second. Okay, I think it was about the Chazon Ish said something about wearing yarmulkes, and the person said, "What do you mean? There's a Bir Hagra that says that wearing yarmulkes is a midas chasidus." So the Chazon Ish said that he saw the Gra in a dream, and the Gra told him that he was chayzer. So they asked this Chaim Kanievsky. Chaim Kanievsky did not believe that the Gra. He said this is not the way the Chazon Ish spoke. He wouldn't have told them even if the Gra did come, whatever. Okay, and obviously there's a type of story today. I'm sure you can make a whole. Is the Chazon Ish? This is the way he would talk, isn't he? Way Chaim Kanievsky does believe, doesn't? Okay, and then he brings down, interesting enough, that about something else. Chaim Greineman said that the Chaim Greineman, who's also one of the Gedolei Talmidei Chazon Ish, said that he heard from the Chazon Ish that the Gra came to him a few times in dreams to talk to him and learning, and other issues. So here you have, on one hand, Chaim Kanievsky saying, okay, so maybe it could be about this piece, that's what bothered Chaim Kanievsky, that the Gra is saying he's chayzer and he's going to come to the Chazon Ish. Maybe that, okay, whatever. Anyway, this is a story, and just one other story, just to say for the sake of a story. It seems in the late 1940s there was an issue. There was not a lot of food in Eretz Yisrael, so some people allowed powdered milk. Others asered it. So 2 bachrim from Hebron came to the Chazon Ish to ask him about using this. So one asked him, and the Chazon Ish told him, "No way, you can't eat it." Another one said, "You could. It's just a chashash." Okay, we come back to Yeshiva's Hebron. There's a stira. 2 guys walked in. Each one got a different psak. What did the Chazon Ish say? So someone from the Kevin went back to the Chazon Ish asking, "What's going on?" He says, "What do you mean? I said both. Both were saying the truth." And he starts smiling. He says like this: "One guy looked like a gibor. He's a strong bacher. He asked me. I said, no, you can't, because it's not going to hurt him if he doesn't have food." It was in a time there wasn't a lot of food. So he said, "You don't be." The other guy, he was a skinny little wimpy guy. So I told him he could be Makel. So you see that it was a tailored psak. He understood the situation, but it wasn't meant to become the psak for Klal Yisrael at the time. This is obviously before the internet, etc., etc. Anyway, so the point is that one has to be very careful. This is general for the Chazon Ish, and it's also general for Chaim Kanievsky, which we will get to Amir Tzashem in a special episode dealing with these type of things with Chaim Kanievsky. Now, to our main, as I call it, the meat and potatoes of our story. What's the story? What's going on here? What does the Chazon Ish? What's going on? So for me, also is that Lamashor Kalman Kahana says a line, and he says that people already in the times of the Chazon Ish would tell the Chazon Ish the steerers, they say things, whatever. So the Chazon Ish says, I understand. I wrote a lot. Whatever I wrote, are you going to find steerers? You're not going to find steerers in what I wrote. The Hainu, in things that we know for certain that the Chazon Ish wrote, there's not going to be steerers. And then I come across, this is where Kalman Kahana says B'Shem the Chazon Ish. Then I come across in the Kunshas Yudchet Shois, which we're going to get to momentarily, the Chazon Ish writes a fascinating line, and this I think plays out by the Chazon Ish's writings, a very important thing. Miteva b'nei Adam, it's the nature of people. People read things like reading a letter quickly. You have to be medactic in the lashon chachamim. Ki devrayem nichtavu bediktik yuni. It was written with intensiyum. The kriyas hamehirus, the kriyas ha'iyun heinef, they're opposites. People like to be quick. Some people have fast tfisas. And sometimes you'll find even chachamim that they read svarim very fast and not being machshav what they're reading carefully. And you have to read carefully, especially topics that are very amok. Now, with those introductions, the Chazon Ish is Yodua. He wrote on purpose, very hard to understand. You have to be medayik in everything he says. Every tag shabbatag means something by him. Again, I'm not saying like as a rishon, but it means a lot. Okay, now, so what's the shita that they say over? So number one is like this. Already a year after he dies, the Sri Diyesh, in a letter to Rav Herzog, writes that he found something in a Chuvas Hagoinim that was found in the Kairag Niza, and he was all happy with it. But he says, he writes this in a letter, but they say in Eretz Yisrael, the Chazon Ish says, Ein lahavi es Chuvas Hagoinim v'sifrei Rishonim shenimtza achar beis Yosef b'cheshben halacha. That's what they say over. So it already got to the Sri Diyesh, who was not in Eretz Yisrael, the Shitah of the Chazon Ish. And as I said, the letters of the Chazon Ish were not yet published. It was published a year or two later. Rav Dessler has there's 2 letters published in that he had conversations with the Chazon Ish. Also, some type of thing that you can't rely on new manuscripts. Okay, and Amir Hashem, we will get to explain more the letters and talk more about the letters of Rav Dessler in the next episode. Okay, there's a Yid. There was a great, tremendous Talmud Chacham, a Dayan in Haifa, Rabbi Yaakov Rosenthal, who was also a Talmud by the Chazon Ish. He was a tremendous guy. The way I heard of him was because when I was in the Mir, I learned by one of the lesser-known Magidi Shiurim in the Mir at the time was Rameir Shmulevitz, the youngest son of Reb Chaim Shmulevitz. His father-in-law was this Rabbi Yaakov Rosenthal. Rabbi Yaakov Rosenthal was a famous guy. His father was the Rav of Shaar Chesed, who was also a guy, and he wrote 15 volumes on Rambam, Mishnas Yaakov. So he writes, he came across a piece of the Ravid that was printed for the first time, manuscript on the side of the Shas Vilna. He went, and he thought it could answer up a whole thing. So he comes into his Rabbi the Chazon Ish. He says, "Va'anali maran devada yoduali shitasoi she'ein lismoich al kisvei yad hanimtzoim b'hafsakas mesayros dar dar." You must know my shita not to rely on manuscripts. And okay. So here we have a Talmud testifying about his Rebbe, the Chazon Ish, about manuscripts. Okay. So the question is, what does he hold? So far, it seems like he holds not to rely on it. Now, what I'm going to show now, the next bunch of pieces of information are going to be proofs that he holds that you could rely on manuscripts at times. Number one, I already mentioned the Chazon Ish's first work comes out in 1911. Already this work, it deals with a lot of Archaim topics. And he quotes, one of the works that he quotes many, many times with great, great kavod is the words of the Mishnah Berurah. And we know there's a letter of the Chazon Ish. And the Chazon Ish talks about the Mishnah Berurah in other places with unbelievable kavod, saying he's like the Lishkas Hagazis. And we know he argues on the Mishnah Berurah many times. And he talks about the Mishnah Berurah, if you open up Chazon Ish Archaim, dozens and dozens of times, hundreds and hundreds of times. But yet, anyone who knows, you learn Mishnah Berurah for a few minutes, you come across that the Mishnah Berurah is relying on Rishonim. You would think that somewhere, one of the times, the Chazon Ish should say, by the way, Mishnah Berurah, we don't rely on new Rishonim. He never once mentions it, and he's quoting him from 1911 and onwards. And he knew Mishnah Berurah, ganz klar, he uses it for everything. He went through klar, he points out his issues all the time. So to me, this is already something. It's a raya of some sort. Again, I'm sure people could argue that's a point. But now let's go into the Ksavim of the Chazon Ish. Take a deep dive. So the Chazon Ish is known. He took different pulmusim in halacha, different controversies in halacha. He took part of B'chayav. One of the most famous controversies that took place in his lifetime was the Dateline Shaila, which is worthy of an episode or two, not from me, but basically Yeshivas Mir and others were stuck in Shanghai in the 1940s, and the question was what to do based on the Dateline Shaila, which days to observe Yom Kippur. So big tumult and Gedolim, everyone was involved, and mamish what to do, and asking different Gedolim, and there were meetings. Okay. So at the time, who gets involved? The Chazon Ish. Another Gadol gets involved, Rav Tukashinsky. People who are familiar with the sugya know that a lot of the discussion revolves around three Rishonim. Besides the Balamar and the Kuzari, which is its own discussion, how relying on the Kuzari la'alacha and the Chazon Ish relying on the Kuzari la'alacha, it's its own discussion, which we mentioned a little bit in the episode we spoke about the Kuzari. But number one, there's a piece in a Ravid, in the Kasaf Sham of the Ravid, which was printed in the 1930s from manuscript in a journal called Skula. And this plays a role in the conversation of the Chazon Ish and of Tukashinsky. Another chibur, a Talmud of the Rush called Yesod Olam, which was printed in the 1770s, and another chibur from Rabbi Avram Bar Chia, also an early Rishon, very involved in astronomy, that was printed from manuscript in the 1850s. These three svarim are very crucial in the sugya of the datelines. If one opens up, the Chazon Ish authored a work known as, in his work on the datelines, I don't have it in front of me, Kuntris Yudche Shois. And he publishes it literally right after the 1941 controversy. And if you look, Lamashal, in the newspapers of the time, in Yud Gimel El, 1941, Reb Zevin writes an article where he gives the background. What's the machlokes? What he gives the audience in the Hatzofa paper. What's the machlokes about? And he really puts it down in Zevin style, giving you the background, when was the first time the Shaila was discussed, and different materials about it. And he says one of the main makayos in the sugya is this Yesod Olam. So now Chazon Ish is not. People mistakenly say Chazon Ish didn't even care about these Rishonim, but he didn't even see them. He was just quoting it because Rav Tukashinsky uses them, and he was coming to argue on him. So he uses Rav Tukashinsky's quotes, and he doesn't. It's clear if you learn carefully the kuntris, he checked up these svarim, and he uses them. He doesn't dismiss them. He could have said a line, which he does in other controversies, and say, "Don't bother, don't bring me rise from new manuscripts." He's handling the whole in the kuntris Yudchashois the whole time. He's handling as if they're regular shittas in the sugya that one has to deal with. Of these three, what I call new manuscripts. One was mamish printed less than 10 years before, and the other two were printed in past few hundred years, and they were not from way back. So here we see him using them, and he doesn't say boo about the problem. Another pulmus that also took place in Eretz Yisrael a little later was a pulmus known as the pulmus Shiurim, which became a sharp machlokes with Rav Avram Chaim Na, the Baal Ksais HaShulchan. And the Steipler got involved with this, also writing chiburim about it. This also became a very hot topic. In the course of this discussion, we find that it was brought to the attention of the Chazon Ish that there's a tshuva of the Goinim. So says the Chazon Ish that I saw a tshuva of the Goin. Ra'isi tshuvas hagoin hanitbas ba'itzer goinim, which we spoke all about the chibur of the itzer goinim. Va'af shein l'smeichal kisvayadim nimtzah ma'afsakas misaris dar l'dar. Even though I hold you can't really rely on it. Amakan nirin hadvarim shein divrei hagoin. It sounds reliable. You can rely on it. This piece was discovered already as early as 1802. I have not yet located who was the first person to use it, but since then we have many sources that say whatever it says in this Chuvas HaGoinim on the topic, and the Chazon Ish doesn't dismiss it. He says no. He brings you down the whole piece. He has a whole shot how to understand it. He's arguing with other people how to understand it. But the point is, he's not saying, oh, it doesn't make a difference. He adds in a key line over here, which we'll get back to, but he's using it in this pulmus. And the same page, there's a famous thing which we already mentioned. The Meiri gets a bad slack. They claim that the Chazon Ish, there's even a Mipia Shmua type of thing. He's sort of like not to the Meiri. Let's open up what the Chazon Ish says. Number one, in the Kuntris Shiurim, which we're talking about right now, on the same page, he says, he says, I didn't see it inside. Someone gave me a copy of what it says, and this is what and he fits in, and fine, and he doesn't dismiss it. In another place, in Chazon Ish and Hilchos Tefillin, he says there's a Meiri, and he says we should be machshir kiven da davar mavur b'meiri lahachshir v'aloi I efshel lintais midivrei rishonim. Okay, now I'm not telling you that you're going to find 100 quotes of the Meiri in the Sefer. He doesn't, and that will get to why. But the point is, he's not dismissing it outright. But now the story goes further. At some point in the late 1940s, I believe it is, someone wants to print the Chibur Shaar Hamayim of the Rashba for the first time for manuscript. This person knew the Chazon Ish in Bnei Brak. He comes into the Chazon Ish. He's printing its manuscript. So he wants to know, now obviously he's asking the Chazon Ish if he can print it for manuscript because he knows the Chazon Ish has something up with manuscripts. He says like this: even though the Chazon Ish says in contradictions Shiurim that ein lismay chalakis fi'alim tzal mafsakin zers dar b'chulu, but he says this davar bar the Shaar Mayim ula Rashba. You look carefully at this, you could tell it's the Rashba, print it, no problem. So David Tzvi Hillman, from another tremendous Talmid Chacham from Bnei Brak, in his book review under a pen name on the Shaar Mayim, says here we see not like people think with the Chazon Ish. Some people think from the Kunshas Shiurim you can't. The Chazon Ish held anti-printing of manuscripts. What do you mean? He's telling him here you could. Just it has to have an important piece of information, which is we have to be bevadai that it is the Rishon. Now, obviously, that's a conversation that needs to be had. Fine. So now I'm showing you from yet another source that the Chazon Ish holds from the Shaar Hamayim. He was okay with it. Now, there's another work that relates to this conversation, is that Rav Moshe Lipschitz, who is a tremendous Talmid Chacham, he was a librarian somewhere in America, so he talks about the Chazon Ish Shitah, and he says, if you open up, there's a Chazon Ish in Hilchos Megillah. The Chazon Ish says as follows: Kol divrei habirkei Yosef nichtavu, the words of the Chidah and Birkei Yosef, was when Shaloi haya biyadai loy haramban v'loy haritva. Aval kishezachinu l'divreihem, ein makom mashakasav of Birkei Yosef. Then you see the Chazon Ish is embracing a new discovery, the Ritva, the Rashba, that came out and after the Chidah, we already were Meirich has all these farm. So too, in another place, I found the Chazon Ish says in Hilchos in Even Ezer that Shuv Matzasi came b'chidushei Ramban b'achroinim lo yahayalem sefer zeh l'chein nislavatu b'zeh. Okay, another discussion. We mentioned that we spoke about Hilchos Kriyas HaTorah of Reish Chodesh is a ganze dion. So I quoted then that that people said, the Rebbe says Al Meltzer and a bunch discuss, if the Gedolim would have had the Ramban on Megillah, everyone was relying on the quote of the Ramban found in the Ran. But the Ramban was published in the 1790s, and then we see much, much more on the Sugya, and that would have changed, that even perhaps the Gra would have changed his mind. So much so, this relates to how to how to have the breaks in Kriyas HaTorah Reish Chodesh. So who also embraces this Ramban? Chaim Kanievsky brings down the Chazon Ish. Okay, so we see yet again that there are times that he's using these Rishonim. Okay, just two more Marmakaimis, and then we'll come to the conclusion. This Rav Tiger, who I've quoted numerous times, he brings that he found also other places. He brings a place where the Chazon Ish brings down Achakach Ra'isi B'Taisis Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. So that's another manuscript published for the first time in recent years, and the Chazon Ish is using it halacha l'maisa. So again, we have a Maramakim, which would show that the Chazon Ish, at least certain times, is accepting Rishonim. And one last thing, he brings us a case of in Hilchos Avodah Zarah. There's a Taisus Rabbeinu Elchanan, also a new manuscript from the thing, and Chazon Ish brings it down for. I believe if someone does an extensive examination, the Chazon Ish, you'll find a bunch more of these type of things. No one has done it up till now. But the point is like this. At this point, and this is how we're concluding episode number 1, it seems, and this is how Rav Tiger understands it also, and others, is like this. That the Chazon Ish is willing to accept when something, ad halacha l'maisa, a new discovery, if he's convinced that it's a real tshuva. Therefore, he held l'mashal in the sugya of the Kunshas Shiurim. There's a Gainim, a new manuscript of Gainim, Gainika. No, Chazon Ish embraces it. Meiri, it fits into the sugya. That did not get him nervous. So now, obviously, I'm going to leave on a cliffhanger. And I brought a bunch of different proofs. I think the proofs, maybe you might say one at itself is not, but I believe putting them all together, something emerges. Obviously, I have to admit now, we'll give a sneak preview to that, there are times he's against it. When is that? Amir Hashem, I hope to be put in proper perspective the next episode.
Okay, fascinating. We have plenty to digest here on this episode. Looking forward to the next episode. So a couple things. You mentioned Rav Tiger. I had the opportunity to meet Rav Tiger. He was in America recently. And we discussed, as we discussed with him in Eretz Yisrael, that he will join us in the very near future to discuss his participation in editing of Reb Chaim's Svarim. If you haven't seen, check out online. You Google YouTube of Uri Tiger, fascinating videos of him discussing Reb Chaim's Svarim. There's videos of Reb Chaim coming to visit him. Do you imagine Reb Chaim coming to visit him in Yerushalayim, taking his time after he visited his Shver and the Kaisel and going on Chol to visit this Uri Tiger? So he obviously had tremendous amounts of Akar Satayv.
So there's even one video relating to this with the Kriyas HaTorah Rosh Chodesh. He has a conversation, and if you don't know the sugya, you can't tell the sugya. But once you know this, one video where Reb Chaim Kanievsky says, yeah, and he opens up the Mishnah Berurah, he learns the whole sugya with him inside about the Kriyas HaTorah and the Gra Shitah with Rosh Chodesh. One of these videos, incredible.
Now, as promised, people are always asking, what do you have going on behind you? They don't even know that what's behind you is like a tipa shabiyam, a tiny, tiny drop of the amount of Yisraelim you have scattered around Eretz Yisrael and all your different machsanim, your different storage houses. So turn around, pull out a random sefer, and tell us what's going on.
Okay, so I'm going to pull out a sefer. It's higher up, easier to get to. And the significance of the sefer is that right before, I'm going to show you the sefer in a second, right before, less than 24 hours before this past Shavuos, I get an email that this sefer came out. And this is already causing me problems. I live in Ramat Beit Shemesh. There's no way in the world this is getting to Yerushalayim. How am I going to have Simchas Yantif? Some people, they have Simchas Yantif with wine, with meat, and yes, I do like cheesecake, but once I know that this sefer is out, it's over, and it's going to be very depressing. I automatically start making the necessary arrangements, and luckily, it comes through and it comes to me. It's called It's called Toldos Adam from Rebuvim Hagolis. It's a book that he wrote, his first work, which he wrote in, let's check the year, it says in 1912 it came out in Lemberg. It's his first work, and he wrote over 50 works on the Marsha. Incredible work. It's published by Ahavat Shalom. Now, what's the significance of this work is, number one is it was very rare, very hard to find. And also, they have the nephew of Rebuvim Hagolis is alive, is in his 80s, is working together with them to publish a lot of different materials, new materials. And in the copy of Rebuvim Hagolis' own edition of this Toldos Adam, he had hundreds of Haisafas. So they put it all in with other materials, and literally, it's a beautiful edition, worth every penny. Also, they have a bunch of letters that he had with different Gedolim that wrote to him after he sent him the Sefer. He wrote this when he was in his low 20s. Mamish, a beautiful Sefer, and it was beautifully done, high quality paper, worth your money, and this helped me have a proper Simchas Yantif. It came, and I was able to have Simchas Yantif.
Beautiful. Okay, so obviously you could do 10 episodes on Rebuvim Hagolis in 30 seconds. Who he was, around when he was born, and what did he do?
This is very tough. Let's say 1911. He's late 1880s, I believe it is that he's born, because this is when he's 21 or 22. He dies in the 70s. He's Arichas Yam, but he doesn't have children. He's married twice. In Lemberg, he was a Meicher Svarim. He wrote tons of Svarim articles, newspapers, and he was also a publisher of Svarim, but he also published his own Svarim. But he was obviously no ordinary person. Lamashal, he comes to Eretz Yisrael, he makes Aliyah in the 30s, goes to visit Rav Kook. Rav Kook makes a bracha on seeing Adam Gadol when he sees him. Rav Kook was in correspondence with him. Rav Kook has Askama, which can only be found in certain editions of his Nefesh Chaya on Archaim, or on his work on the Zohar. Other things, Rav Kook was familiar with him and liked him. It has a bracha. Can be found in an eyewitness account of someone that was there at the time. Anyway, he ends up putting out many more Sfarim in Eretz Yisrael. While he's in Eretz Yisrael, he works for Moshe Rav Kook. He also was the chief librarian in Tel Aviv. He built a major Sfarim library for that period of time. It's actually still exists today. So he's a Hasidic Yid from Lemberg, Galicianer, but he also had Zionistic leanings, and he had to do with Lamashal Rav Kook, but he had to do with all types of people. And he mamish was a legendary Bakiyas in all of Torah, including Kabbalah, authored 50, 60 Sfarim easily.
And since this is a Reb Chaim episode, you mentioned his connection to Reb Chaim very briefly, if you want to mention.
Oh, yes. So even in this new edition, he mentions that Reb Chaim Kanievsky loved him. There's a few times, I think I quoted in season 1 even, Chaim Kanievsky met him, knew him, had great respect for him, and so too the Chazon Ish did. The Chazon Ish met him and had great respect for him. I do recall in Nefesh Chaya, there's even a piece that he says over something that he heard from the Chazon Ish. But they both, the Chazon Ish and both Reb Chaim Kanievsky and the Chazon Ish liked him a lot. This nephew was there at least one of the conversations. He had conversations with Chaim Kanievsky about Reuven Margolis. He brings it in this new introduction in this work, and so to tie it to Reb Chaim Kanievsky, he liked it. And to end, Chaim Kanievsky quotes Reuven Margolis Keseder in Lamashal, his work on the Rambam. He quotes his work on the Zohar. Other places he quotes Reuven Margolis B'Shmoi many times. Now, what's the Chiddush? He's a Zionist. Lamashal, you go into Yeshivas Panovich, you'll find the Margolis Hayam, and you'll see that certain things are blacked out or ripped out because he dates the Sefer to the Medina. So these type of terrible Deus Kaizvais that he has. Anyway, all in all, Lamaisa Chasidish Yidden, Mizrach Yidden, Yeshivish Yidden, all like this person. He has an unbelievable schus that he had, even though he didn't have children, but Ada Yoim, Klal Yisrael is having a sachana from his Sfarim. So now, this new printing, I recommend. Here you go.
Excellent, wonderful. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the next episode. Thank you once again. This episode was sponsored, if you're still listening, in memory of Moshe Chaim ben Yitzchak David, all of season 2. Questions, comments, suggestions, dedication, opportunities, please reach out to myself at shweidm@ou.org or Rabbi Brot, eliezerbrodt@gmail.com.